Good evening and happy almost end of Heritage Month. I'm Rupert Koopman of the Botanical Society, and today we're going to be discussing heritage and our place in heritage and how we interact with the plants. I'm just going to quickly share screen. Apologies in advance. I'm on a different computer, so everything is interesting. Right, so if you've been reading your Felt and Flora, you would have seen in the September issue, we had this article about people, plants and heritage. Specifically, we did talk about Mamre. So Mamre is a little town up the west coast of the Cape here, about 60 kilometers north of Cape Town. And this picture is two of the Tannies who help with the Mamre flower show. And unfortunately, Tanny Sophie on the right has passed away a couple of years ago. And now we're just talking about the linkage between people on the ground, their attachment to the plants and traditional knowledge. But I think we want to get to this point today of where we're not just talking about heritage as something which is a part, it's the integration of natural and cultural heritage. It's a good month to have this conversation. So without any further ado, I want to introduce Deirdre Prince Solani, who I met on a walk recently. And she is really a world-renowned heritage specialist. And we're so grateful that you made some time for us tonight, Deirdre. And I'm also just looking forward to the interweaving of the different voices that we have on tonight's webinar. So if you could please unmute yourself, I'm going to share your PowerPoint on this side, and then just tell me next slide when you're ready.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Rupert, for the invitation to be here. And I think that this conversation is very timely, and it's really wonderful to be a part of this platform today, and especially in Heritage Month. When I was thinking through my approach and what to say in the very short time that I have, I thought that perhaps one of the best ways to talk a little bit about heritage is to share some of the concepts, perhaps some of the provocations which have emerged out of some of the work that I've been doing across the African continent, the Caribbean, and Asia, the Asian region. And I think that would be a way of starting. And so the very first concept that I would like to introduce, which is on slide 2, Rupert, is that of interconnectedness. And I think because I've worked in World Heritage for a long time, before shifting and making a segue into working with intangible cultural heritage, I also worked in a museum and worked in the museum sector for a while. And so I've had almost two worlds. I've had the world of tangible heritage, which is very much the thing that we can see and that we can touch and that has texture to it, be they sites or be they plants for that matter, but also buildings and monuments and material culture, so the objects and artifacts that we would find in museums and galleries. And with the shifts that I have made in my professional life, it's been very interesting to also kind of see how globally there are shifts happening which challenge the binaries of this notion of the tangible and the intangible, and that they don't speak to each other or that they don't have an interrelationship with each other. And the 1972 World Heritage Convention, for example, shifted very much from only a focus on declaring natural sites and declaring cultural sites, and began to include nominations which were called cultural landscapes, which was a recognition of the fact that actually people and place, people and environment interact with each other, and that this relationship is a dynamic one. And so this recognition of cultural landscapes for me was quite pivotal on the global stage in making this recognition and saying that this binary that we've been working in is actually not working very well. It's separating, and it's creating problems, particularly for site management as well. And the image that you see there that I've chosen to use is an image of myself many years ago in the Mijikenda Kaya Sacred Forest in the coastal region of Kenya. And this particular site I've chosen because it was first declared a World Heritage Site. And then a number of years later, the Kaya elders, together with the state agencies within Kenya, decided that actually what they wanted to do in order to safeguard, in order to protect the values associated with the site, they needed to ensure that the living heritage or the intangible cultural heritage elements, the practices, the rituals, the way of interacting, engaging with the forest and the life in the forest with the ancestors, all of those things needed to be safeguarded as well. Having it as a World Heritage Site was simply not enough. There was a need to actually look at the intangible aspects of it. And so it's been a very interesting for me to follow the story of this particular site and the people who engage with the site, and this kind of global shift that took place, and how that's had an impact at this particular site. And there are many examples like that. I think a second example for me of the interconnectedness between these binaries that have been imposed, I think, on us, is that of the 2003 convention, UNESCO Convention for the Safeguarding of Living Heritage or Intangible Cultural Heritage, and the ways in which we coexist as human beings with the more than human world, and this interrelationship between them. And an example that I'd like to share with you here is one of an experience I had over a 2-year period. I was asked to work with colleagues in Ghana, where we conducted a needs assessment for strengthening the capacity of custodians to safeguard living heritage. And this then led to the development of a strategic plan and a proposal, which just a few weeks ago has received very, very generous funding for the country. And through this assessment process, I spoke to a number of various custodians, and one of them was a traditional healer. And one of the issues that he raised as a threat to his practice as a traditional healer was that access to the forested areas were becoming really difficult. But more so, access to plants. He was recognizing that there were plants that were disappearing in the forest. And a lot of it was associated with the mono-agricultural industry, with the introduction of fertilizers, with the overuse of land, with water that is being contaminated that then enters into waterways. And he was unable then to practice as a traditional healer. And in this conversation that we were having with him, but with others as well, it was also very interesting to bring in some of the Western scientific knowledge that had been gathered through research by the Ghanaians, who were saying that many of these areas where these mono-agricultural practices were taking place were the ones that were most vulnerable to climate change and to disaster. And so here we had, on the one hand, a cultural issue around a cultural practice of being a traditional healer, but interwoven with a wider range of environmental and natural aspects, which needed to be taken into consideration in terms of safeguarding. So this notion of interconnectedness and coexistence, I think, is something that we need to think about when we think about heritage holistically and not in these boxes. And then a third aspect which I wanted to raise around interconnectedness is that around sustainable development and the notion of sustainable cities. And I'm raising this because we are in the city of Cape Town. We can drive out and we can find natural spaces. In some areas, we have parks, we have verges, where we do have green spaces. But one of the things that troubles me a lot in working within urban spaces not only on the African continent, but in other parts as well, where there is rapid urbanization, is the notion of memory landscapes, and how very often we are erasing things, we are erasing values which we don't pay attention to. And these are often sensorial in terms of tall buildings, the erasure of certain smells and scents that are associated with place, the abundance of flowers, and so on. And I think that that is, again, something which talks about this interconnectedness, that even our cities, we can't think of them purely only as green cities. We need to think of them as green cities which contain particular values that are people related. Next slide, please. I'm going to try to go faster. The next kind of concept or keyword that I want to introduce is this notion of dynamic. And this is where I think my work particularly in living heritage, which I've done for the last 10 years or so, has really begun to shape my thinking around how in appreciating heritage, we need to also see that values change over time, and that the ways in which particular kinds of heritage shifts and changes, that it is dynamic, and that it's in response to very particular contexts, and that there is a place for interpretation and reinterpretations. And I'm deliberately saying this because I become very anxious and I become very uneasy when we reduce heritage to something which is traditional, or where we think about it as something that is fixed. If we know that once something is documented in a particular way, that's how it must happen, a particular practice must happen, and not thinking around it in terms of how it changes. And I've given here an image of a pencil bag that is made from bark cloth, which is a traditional material that is made from the bark cloth tree in Uganda. For many years, the practice of making clothing from bark cloth was beginning to die out. And it was because of many reasons. One was that overuse of trees, the cutting down of trees for the making of charcoal, for energy. It was also because there wasn't an understanding around how to peel the bark from the tree so that the tree doesn't die. And then also obviously also the growth in terms of population growth and so on. And then, of course, just in terms of youthful audiences, the reluctance to wear bark cloth because it's not regarded as fashionable or sophisticated. And what's been very interesting to see is that when it was bark cloth making was identified as an important element or living heritage element for Uganda, and particularly for the Buganda people, there was then an initiative around planting more trees, elders teaching younger generations in how to harvest and how to prepare the bark cloth. And then what the younger generation did was to say, so now how are we going to innovate and make other products from these, which can then serve as a form of economic benefit for us. And so this notion of heritage being dynamic, I think, is something that we also need to bear in mind as we move forward. The next one is around valuing. And I wanted here, sorry. So the next one is around identity. And so identity, I think it's very important when we think about heritage, that identity is core to how individuals or groups identify what is valuable and what is of value to them. And this particular photograph I took of my father, my 90-year-old father, at Ulmus Jacta's farm in Constantia, which is a flower farm. And my father has memories of growing up in the Akkers in Vasco, and they had a very large lot of land, and they planted flowers, and they had cows and goats and all of that. And so for his 90th this year, I took him to Ulmus's farm for him to go and see that in spite of forced removals and group areas, there were spaces in which people were able to continue the practice of cultivating and of harvesting. And in terms of our family kind of tradition, our family histories, this tradition of planting continues. So in my own suburban garden, you will find things like wilde als, like bohu, like the aloe, and it's used as for medicinal purposes in our home and with friends and family, because that's how we grew up. So through generations, this is recognized as being an important part of our identity, including our children. So my son would ask for some aloe to cure a skin condition and not ask for lotion from the pharmacist, because it's known, it's recognized that this is part of who we are. And it's a living, ongoing process. And then valuing, if we can maybe, Rupert, if you can move to the second last slide, which is around valuing. And this is a question that I would like to pose, that I would want us to hold with in view as we begin to think carefully around values and why certain things are valuable and what lies beneath it all. And I've decided to use this image from Kumasi. I spent time with some of the young and the old kente cloth weavers in Kumasi. And what was really, really powerful in the stories that we exchanged was the fact that here was this particular practice that is centuries old of hand weaving kente cloth in these very narrow strips. The fact that the patterns are not written down and not documented with shapes on pen and paper, but that they are sung through songs, and that it's through the songs that the weavers know what patterns they are going to be performing on the loom next. And so there's a movement and there's a singing, there's a song that gets sung as the loom is worked. Now, what struck me about this in the conversations around values was the ways in which the elders and the young people articulated the fact that the precision that is required, because you must, when we see the complete kente cloth, we see all these strips sewn together into something really big. But what they are hand weaving are the smaller ones. And what the weavers were explaining to me was that if you are not precise, if you are not mathematically precise, the pattern can go awry, because those pieces need to be aligned to create something that is really remarkable and something that is beautiful. And so you really need to know what you're doing, and it has to be mathematically done. The songs are sung in indigenous language, and so there's a language skill that is required in order for the practice to continue. And all of these elements combined are what makes the kente cloth something so beautiful and so valuable to the people of Kumasi, but also to people around the world. One of the things which is a threat to the kente cloth making, which was a research study that was done by Ghanaian weavers, was that there are many songs that are disappearing. And so because the songs are disappearing, the kinds of kente cloth designs that are being made are becoming quite staid, and that they are losing the more complex, the more complicated designs. So I think that there's something here that this particular one tells us around, talks about the ways in which a language is valued, the singing of the songs, but also very much how language is beyond words. Language is also about symbols, and being able to read those symbols and understand them and give meaning to them and make meaning of them is such an important part of heritage. So how many of us, when we are walking after a season of umgidis or a season of initiations from boyhood to manhood, how many of us walk around in our suburbs and in the city of Cape Town or anywhere in South Africa, recognizing that that's a young man who's just emerged from umgidi? Are we able to read the signs when someone's head is shaved or wearing a band on the arm, indicating to us that they have experienced a loss in the family? And so this idea of what is our heritage and understanding our heritage opens up an opportunity for us to also explore new languages, new ways of reading our society and our community, and in very exciting ways that speaks to the diversity that is there. And then the last thing I would like to reflect on, and that's around heritage also being about the ghosts and about the hauntings. And I believe that this is true for many, many countries, not only on the African continent, but in other spaces that I've worked in as well, like the Cayman Islands or in Jamaica, or in the Republic of Korea, Japan. There are always ghosts and hauntings. And in South Africa's case, in particular, we had colonial rule, poll tax, the Land Act of 1913, the Group Areas Act, which has an impact on the landscape, on what we see as the ownership of the land, as opposed to the custodianship of the land. We also have the fact that intangible cultural heritage or living heritage in some instances remains as fragments or has been effectively disappeared or erased because of forced removals and dislocations and disruptions from the land. And I also want to say in this case, and it's been an interesting process investigating this in other countries as well, it's how there are ghosts and hauntings around. We have separated the science or the Western science from the knowledge, traditions, the practices that are indigenous. And in languaging of our knowledge of the earth, the sea, of sky, of plants, we are often inhibited from fully understanding the meaning and the value of the heritage, because we are articulating it in a language which is quite alienating or alienated, or where we weigh one to be more important than the other. And there's a recognition of a particular way of calling something above another, and not recognizing that at a grassroots level, very often the knowledge that is there is a knowledge that is born out of experience and interacting and engaging, and from a different way of being in the world and a different way of knowing the world. And so I think the last point I'd like to raise when thinking around this issue of heritage as well, it's how do we then restore the sacred, and what one Taiwanese indigenous scholar talks about, the mystery. So how do we talk about our plant knowledge and our relationship as humans, humanity, with the more than human world that is not reductivist and not extractive, where we can say we appreciate the appearance of the arum lilies because it's indicative of a weather pattern changing, and not to have it as an extractivist, oh, so this is its medicinal purpose. A plant, a flower doesn't need to be reduced to that. It could be something far more than that. It could be stories and metaphors that have been in our society for a very, very long time that we need to think of as a part of that heritage. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Rupert.
Wow, Deirdre. You touched on so much. I got a page full of notes over here. I just wanted to say that my mom's parents were also from that Vasco area, so we must just have a look and see what's going on in the family tree. I also just wanted to remind the audience today that right now, and I've just got back from Worcester, but the BotSoc branches and BotSoc National and members of council as well have been having a Pathfinder conference, the old branch convention at the Karoo National Botanical Gardens. And this question of identity, you know, what is the BotSoc? Where are we going to go taking it forward? Deirdre will also appreciate the fact that the BotSoc started in 1913. You know, it's very an opportune time to engage with our legacies and take the good things out of it, and you know, not the mysteries as well, without sugarcoating the bad stuff, because I think that's how we grow as people, as an organization. So that really hits the spot. And I think also what Deirdre was saying in terms of you know, the Kente weavers and the songs disappearing. That's very much the same sort of thing we've been experiencing in not just medicinal plants, but plant use in general in South Africa. And we really need to be leaning in to that as well. Okay, so the next part is going to be quite interactive. I'm sharing screen again, so let's hope this goes okay. And Glenn, I'm going to ask you to put on your camera, please. And I think this is just going to be a bit of a conversation between the two of us. Excuse me, I'm, like I said, new computer, so good. Glenn, I think, you know, like I said, everyone who's a BotSoc member here should have read our article in Felt and Flora, so they must take it as read. For those of you who don't know Glenn, he is an education guru at Iziko Museums in Cape Town. And well, I've known him for quite a long time because the plant circles are very small. But I think in the last period at BotSoc, we've had quite a lot of interaction with Glenn. Last year with our closing down lunch, we were led through the museum by Glenn at Iziko, and it took us an hour to cover 50 meters, I think, because of the richness of the displays there. And I think, Glenn, I've just got 3 bullet points for us to talk through, and you'll see what they are as we flip through the 3 slides. But I want you to start and maybe just reflect a little bit on what Deirdre had to say, and then given this picture of an 8-daagse neusbos next to the N1 in Worcester, which is where the rest of the BotSoc guys are. What is your view on landscapes and heritage?
Thanks, Rupert. And you stole a little bit of my thunder when you did the first response to Deirdre. Deirdre, my paternal family were also in the Akkers. And it's strange. I haven't heard someone use that in a very long time. But it took me back. I don't consider my family, which in my living memory has been completely urban. And it's difficult for me to connect them to a landscape. But when I think now about when my father and his siblings spoke about growing up, they had quite a lot of memories about walking, about greenness, and about the vlei. And how they would wait for the vlei to appear wintertime so that they could swim. They had a bath that they used to make into a boat, and then they would, go around wintertime. But landscapes, I'm glad that you spoke about, that Deirdre spoke about extractive and non-extractive. I've become more and more interested in looking at landscapes from a non-extractive point of view. And I'm not saying anti-extractive, but to view it through a different lens. And we have many urban examples. Deirdre touched on the urban examples, which are very relatable to us. Not long ago, there was a court case in the Boekap because of structures outside of the Boekap, which would have changed its view, its setting, and its sense of place. When we drive through the Karoo and we look at Table Mountain, people appreciate those landscapes in the way that they look without having any biodiversity knowledge. And of course, we as BotSoc members and as interested parties in this webinar, we already have that knowledge base. And so our lens is forever changed. When we look at a natural landscape, we will of course think about plants, but when we think about humanity, all of us connect to a landscape, whether it be urban, peri-urban, or natural or agricultural, that when we are there, when we see it, when we see a picture of it, we regain a sense of place. This sense of place, of course, is intangible in that it's evoking something eternal, but slightly tangible because to physically be there, you have to actually touch the ground. You, with your eyes, need to see, or you need to smell, or you need to hear the landscape that is around you that you are familiar with. I don't know to what an extent protection is afforded to these landscapes in protecting a sense of place. But of course, this means that landscapes need to be, or portions of the landscape needs to be retained in a certain way so that we inherit, which is linked to heritage, so that we inherit this and it's passed down from generation to generation. And this, of course, has nothing to do with biodiversity knowledge or extracting materials or plants or animals or whatever it may be from that landscape. So it's something that is, it's deeply felt, it's deeply experiential.
Cool. Yeah, and I think in that we can still link it to the plants and think about your opening statement of the Akker, and that landscape doesn't exist anymore. There are no more seasonal wetlands left in Vasco that are extensive, and there are little pockets of maybe, you know, road verges where there's maybe a siering or two, but like that plant landscape that our mutual ancestors grew up with just doesn't exist in that same way anymore. And that's why I think that pushing the urban biodiversity envelope a little bit, just to give people that little reminder, is quite important. So Glenn, I'm going to go into the next slide. And I was recently at Nampo Kaap in Bredasdorp and working with the Elam community, and the Elam community is one which is synonymous with heritage from a Moravian point of view, from a historical cultural point of view, and also interestingly from a green economy point of view. One of the first places in the country where there was formal flower picking. So the flower picking industry, because the area was so rich in these blooms of the leucospermums and proteas and everything else, that's where it started up. But we also tend to talk about places like that in this space as the community. How do we get to a point where we take away the aanhalingstekens, the double commas, and just you know, as Deirdre says, these are all parts of our heritage. You know, it's not a amusement park. Is that being harsh? Of, you know, we go there, we take a day drive, we come back, and like, oh, that was nice, but we don't, you know, change our practice. Let's dip into that a little bit. Yeah,
I think a better way of putting it is that when we almost have this ethnotourism, and we caricature the intrinsic link that local communities share. Unfortunately, I mean, community is an English word which exists everywhere, but unfortunately, when we read between the lines in South Africa, community generally means black, brown, and poor. And then
historically backward.
Yes, or historically and naturally more linked to the environment and the spirit world, you know. And it's something that I have to deal with quite a lot when I look at Indigenous social history education at the South African Museum, deconstructing these things, dispelling essentializations. But I think that things are nested, because local community, and I'm stripping away community and its connotations in the South African context, and which is why I add local. When we have local communities which are multi-generational and have had security of tenure for multiple generations, there is a buildup of knowledge. There is a very, very strong link to that space. That link and that sense of place and the local knowledge about plants and plant uses constitutes many, many aspects of heritage, which we celebrate in places like Elam. How does it change behavior? I think a lot of our work needs to be done in urban areas where we do not talk about links to plants as a as a rural peculiarity. And where we don't speak about natural landscapes as an extensive peculiarity. We have urban green spaces, we have urban open spaces, which are concretely, literally concretely hemmed in. Yet they are still reminders and remnants of landscapes which created a sense of place. So ELM, I've spoken about two aspects. You have multiple generations, and all those generations have had security of tenure. And of course, when you look at an urban landscape like Cape Town, when we speak about the Akkers, three of us, we talk about people, multiple generational communities moved from an area where there was a strong natural connection. And of course, those bits of knowledge make less sense to pass down to your grandchildren when you can't show them the plant, when you can't talk about the seasonality of the water, when you can't talk about waterblommetjies is coming late or early in that year. But we have a lot of work to be done in urban areas when we look at natural heritage that's not just extractive, that's not just biodiversity. Otherwise, it becomes a conservation protected area or rural peculiarity. When we start looking at our natural heritage in cities, particularly in Cape Town, when we look at the massive groundswell within the very broad church Khoisan revivalist movement, where we see various groups that are taking ownership of open areas, green areas, and doing ecological restoration in order to connect to their ancestors. Not in terms of biodiversity conservation. Of course, that's important. Of course, that's one of the things that's a great spin-off for conservationists and conservation-minded individuals. But to say that I cannot connect to my ancestors without restoring the species that were here, that fed, that nourished, that inspired our ancestors. You know, when we look at places like Princess Vlei, where there's been such a beautiful fusion of local communities who have organized around their communal Khoi ancestry and growing identity, linked to an ecological restoration project. And it's absolutely amazing, and it's completely urban.
No, I was going to say, and you know, I think some people from a BotSoc background would immediately be interested in the kind of Khoi thing and the linkage. However, the Kirstenbosch branch has been physically involved in the work at Princess Vlei, both going helping with hacks, but also financially supporting and morally supporting that particular program, which and your telepathy is really good, leads us onto our last slide. So you know, you and I and the BotSoc team on the 23rd of September last week, Friday, had a pre-Heritage Day party at Leeuwenhof, the Premier's residence, Western Cape Premier's residence. So that's Alan and Tracy Windy. So because the Premier's wife is very instrumental in working with BotSoc and Kirstenbosch Gardens. So the SANBI team, in terms of rejuvenating these gardens from an indigenous plant perspective, but also from a signage point of view. And this is a good complex heritage landscape. So you've got the built environment of the old house. You've got old non-South African plants there. You can see the palms, there's oaks and some old wisterias and all of that sort of thing. And then bringing in the Princess Vlei connection, the fact that these kids from Lotus River High are also almost, you know, graduates of the school of Denisha Anand, who works at Princess Vlei. And I think that's quite a long introduction to be, you know, and I want you to take this one home in terms of the role of the youth, but also being mentored by those, like all of us in this space. And they're the torch keepers of heritage. And people always like to say youth are the future, and I like to say youth are the now, because if you wait for them for some sort of future, then they're going to be old. So yeah. How did you find this event, and I mean the potential of it? I mean, I was blown away, and I think there's so much opportunity for us to go forward in this space.
I think that the event was wonderful. I was also a bit transfixed by the picture. So much of it has to do with reclamation. The reclamation point at Leeuwenhof was, of course, the planting of indigenous species at Leeuwenhof. And some of these species, these learners knew because they've been planting it at their school. Mm-hmm. One of the students asked, "Where's Erica verticillata? Have you got it here?"
Yeah.
And they've also been involved with plantings at Princess Flay. So there's that connection of, we know that indigenous species, when we plant them, in some way or another, we are reclaiming them. And it's good to see multiple sites and diverse sites, something as different as Leeuwenhof, from a high school playground to an urban wetland. These three sites and settings couldn't be more different, but the sense of place can be connected using the plants, using indigenous plants and the act of planting them. But I also think it was important to help learners connect the dots and we can often do that through heritage. The biodiversity links don't always make sense in a very, very, very altered landscape like we can see at Leeuwenhof in the picture that you've shared. We don't really link it to natural landscapes. A planted landscape, sure, but not an indigenous intact ecosystem which we've inherited, which is pre-colonial. So it's important to fill those gaps with looking at natural heritage, not just biodiversity, but looking at landscape as heritage, landscape form, landscape physiognomy, landscape components, and that landscapes do not have these finite boundaries. They are nested, they interact with each other. The plants in this case connects Lotus High School, Princess Flay, and Leeuwenhof, making it one landscape where the species make the connections. But then, of course, it's also about occupying space. The fact that the learners were at Leeuwenhof. And then, of course, there's connections in time. On that day, I wore my lion claws. And I said to them, well, when this place was started, it wouldn't have been Leeuwenhof, as we say in Afrikaans. It would have been Leeuwenhof, because there were lions there. It's lion court. And so it also connects us back to a landscape in time. Even if these landscapes are all but altered, completely, it gives us a sense of place of connection. But as educators, as people who are experienced in heritage and in biodiversity management, it's important for us not just to speak about biodiversity, but to contextualize our biodiversity activities.
Totally. And I think what was important there is also the signage that BotSoc put together, which tried to tell that story of the plants in situ, as well as the oak trees, for example, and there's even a sign by the cannon, and to bring together all those stories at a certain point. Cool. We could have this conversation for a very long time, and we probably will. But I think there was a question earlier, which I think Nolwazi's presentation is going to answer for us. So thanks, Glenn. If you can pop your camera off for now. Nolwazi, are you ready for us on that side?
Yeah, I'm ready. Let me share screen.
Cool. So Nolwazi Mbongwa needs no introduction to this audience. She is a researcher working with SANBI and crew on medicinal plants, and she's also a traditional healer herself, and that's one of the reasons we asked her to come on, besides the fact that you're just an awesome person, Nolwazi. So thank you, and we look forward to learning from you.
Yeah, can you see my screen?
Yeah, everything's perfect.
All right. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Rupert, for having me. As Rupert has mentioned, my name is Nola Zimbongwa. So today, basically, my talk is going to be about the impact, or rather the influence, that culture and the ancestors have on medicinal plants, particularly the cultivation of medicinal plants. Okay,
I think, sorry, you need to reshare your screen again.
Oh, okay. Let me stop sharing and then
yeah,
reshare. Yeah. Just as I was in the group for all right. Still not moving.
Okay. I can see the screen. Are you trying to go on a slide?
Yeah, I'm trying to see if it can move to the next one.
Just use your arrows.
I'm using my arrows and it's not moving. Okay.
Just try that again.
Okay, let's stop share and just try again. Technology.
Oh, then let me just see if I make you
All right, it's fine now.
Okay.
Sorry about that, everyone. As I mentioned, that today I'll be speaking about the impact or rather the influence that culture and the ancestors have on the cultivation of medicinal plants and conservation as a whole. So in South Africa, we have 3 different types of traditional healing group, whereby termed, they're all traditional healers, but there's different groups, and these different groups also use nature differently. So the first, we have prophets. So prophets are people that really make use of animal and plant parts. So they rely mostly on prayer, ash, holy water, and in some instances, incense or sage to treat their patients. Herbalists are then not necessarily called or chosen by the ancestors, but they rather know about healing properties of wildlife, including medicinal plants, due to having relationships with someone that is a traditional healer, and they also grew up in a community that makes use of traditional healing methods. Last but not least, we have diviners, which is the most common ones, izangoma, as mostly called in isiZulu. So they are then chosen by the ancestors as part of a spiritual belief system involving manifest ancestral will and guidance. And they undergo training and initiation that is uniquely tailored to the individual and guided by the ancestral spirits. So with this next figure that I'm going to show, or this next slide, I'm going to speak about the different ancestral spirits that influence or rather impact the choices that traditional healers make in terms of which species are they going to use, how are they going to use them, and which species are allowed to be created in terms of cultural and ancestral norms. So these guys have seen traditional healers wearing cloths. So they're not just for decorative purposes. So all these cloths represent the different ancestral spirits that that particular traditional healer has. So there's a lot of ancestral spirits that traditional healers have, but today I will just touch on a few. One of them is called Amandau. So Amandau are ancestral spirits that are said to have originally come from Mozambique, and they are regarded as go between spirits because they are foreign and have settled in an area that they are not native to. So one thing about ancestral spirits is that they go beyond borders. So it goes beyond colonialism when Africans were able to move from one part of Africa to the other. Hence, you can find that a South African healer has ancestral spirits, maybe from Tanzania, for instance. The next one is Amakos. These are indigenous spirits that come from the northern parts of South Africa and are mostly penetrated through the rituals of Ukutwasa amongst Amazulu and some of Amathosa lineages. Amandigi are then regarded as feminine or masculine spirits, which are mostly related to Amakos. Umnono is the spirit that is believed to be the most patient and takes its time before it manifests itself in a person. Abalozi are regarded as whistleblower ancestors because most of the traditional healers that have Abalozi usually use whistleblowing to communicate with the ancestors. Isithunya are then spirits that are associated with the gods and they mostly communicated to via prayer. So Isithunya would be mostly associated with the prophet. But one thing that I want you guys to also take from this is that All these are not mutually exclusive, meaning that a diviner can be a prophet and a prophet can be a herbalist. Because as I mentioned, that when it comes to traditional healing, there are no borders. Same thing with ancestral spirits. A person can have Amandao, at the same time they can have Amakus. So with this slide, I just want us to remember that we are because they were. Meaning that whatever plants we are using today, we are using because we are being guided by the ancestors. We are being shown what we need to use. There are certain family rituals that need to be upheld to ensure that generations to generations, we uphold that spirit of Ubuntu within our own communities and within our own families. And I want us to understand that whatever we do as Africans, or rather those who believe in the ancestors, they do it because there is guidance from the ancestors. And this now brings me back to this, that there is access to Western medication, but there is about 72% of South Africans who still make use of traditional medicine. Why is that? One of the reasons is because of what I mentioned, and also because of the deeply rooted cultural belief systems in traditional medicine, taking into cognizance that traditional medicine does not only heal the physical part of a person. Traditional medicine is a holistic term in healing, whereby we are healing the spiritual side of a person, we are healing the emotional side of a person, we are healing the community, and most importantly, we are healing generational curses. Hence, it is so essential to Africans who believe in this type of cultural and ancestral belief system. However, there is an issue though. There is now a rapid decline in medicinal plants. And this means some of these cultural rites, some of these cultural rituals cannot now be performed effectively, such that some of the traditional healers can't even harvest medicinal plants for themselves and perform those rituals that have been guided by their ancestors in the wild because they simply cannot find plants in the wild. Now they've had to make, or rather make use of an alternative source, which are multi-markets. And multi-markets, because now medicinal plants have been commercialized, it has caused a huge problem in the declining of medicinal plants. Therefore, law enforcement in somewhat has failed to mitigate the exploitation of medicinal plants. And this is partly because there is an interconnected web in the medicinal plant trade. I'm not going to go through this today, but I just want you guys to understand that it's not just an harvester selling to a healer. It's not just a trader selling to a healer. It's an interconnected web of one stakeholder to the other. And most of this, as I've mentioned, is influenced by the ancestors. Cultivation is then now one of the methods that are currently being used to mitigate the decline, but it is not commercialized. One of the reasons, but not the only, is the gaps in the knowledge about the socio-cultural norms associated with using cultivated medicinal plants. We need to understand, number one, are people comfortable with using cultivated medicinal plants? Do they want to use cultivated medicinal plants? But most importantly, on this Heritage Month, do the ancestors allow for that to be done? So now this graph here is part of my MSc study of which of a paper that I published on SAJ botany, where we asked our respondents that, are there certain medicinal plants that the ancestors do not want them to be cultivated because of cultural belief systems? So the majority of respondents mentioned the cycad, that the cycad is not allowed to be cultivated unless you follow certain rituals and certain procedures from the ancestors. And they also mentioned that if ever you do now cultivate this medicinal plant without following the proper procedures in terms of ritual rites, then in the family, there could be a death, there could be lightning in the family, a family could be struck by lightning, and there could be fights in the community also. So certain rituals need to be followed to ensure that these particular medicinal plants do not cause metaphysical dangers to the community. This is also then influenced by what? By ancestors. They're not just deciding to do this on their own. They're not just deciding to appease the ancestors before they cultivate. So this is also an extract from the biodiversity management plan that we've come up with SANBI and the rest of the medicinal plant working group, where we asked our respondents that, have we used cultivated medicinal plants before? The majority of the respondents said they have used medicinal plants before, cultivated medicinal plants. But then when we asked them, are there any problems associated with cultivating medicinal plants? Most of them mentioned spiritual problems. They were like, when you guys come up with these nurseries, it's a good idea and we definitely want it to be done because the wild is declining. The wild medicinal plants are declining. But the issue now is that you guys start these nurseries without following the right cultural and ancestral procedures, where we need to come on that land and appease the ancestors, ask the gods of that land to give us guidance and also to give us blessings for us to use that land before we can cultivate. And also then now they believe that the moment a nursery starts, or rather is implemented without them knowing, and by the time that maybe the plants have grown, we say, go take from that nursery, they feel that their ancestors would not allow them to use those plants because on the inset, they were not allowed to even start and ask for guidance from the ancestors. However, despite them saying all this, they still believe that cultivation is a solution. So this extract is from my PhD, which I'm currently doing. And I wanted to understand from my respondents that what does conservation mean to them? Does it mean anything? Are they already doing certain things on their own to conserve biodiversity as a whole, including animals and plants? So when I asked them what does conservation mean to them, some of them said, we used to care about nature, but the way conservation authorities have been treating us has made us not to care. Some are like, we feel like it's only for educated people because they've excluded us from using nature that we were given by the gods and the ancestors. So when I asked them what actions do you take to conserve the plants, the majority of them were actually already currently cultivating medicinal plants in their home gardens. So when I asked them, how or where did you learn about conservation? The majority of them said they either learned from an elder or they learned from training when they were trained to be a healer. So when I asked them if we ever attended awareness programs, they said, yes, we do attend awareness programs, but the message that's always shared through these programs is so scientific that it does not align with who we are. It doesn't align with our identity. Hence, we hold that oral transfer of information from our elders so highly because when they explain certain things about conservation, they bring along our identity. They bring along our family structure and our whole generation as a whole, as a community and as a family. But when you guys speak to us as conservationists, the one thing you want to tell me is the scientific names of the plants, is that it's protected in the wild, but you don't then relate it to my culture. You don't relate it to who I am. So then now this brings me to this question of how can we now incorporate culturally appropriate interpretations of traditional healing and medicine in conservation if we do not understand the language spoken by those who use these resources? So this next slide, I'm just going to give you guys an example of some of the medicinal plants that I saw in the gardens of the healers that I interviewed. So this plant is a cycad, as most people know. Some of the species of the cycad are already extinct in the wild. And the traditional healers actually observed that and are already cultivating it in their home. This is the Howothiopsis species. It's also one of the threatened species in South Africa. It's already being cultivated in a home of a traditional healer. But I want us to also take note of this picture in particular. So this cycad has been harvested, but because the healer knows that if they cut down the whole tree, that means the whole tree dies. They've only harvested the leaves. So this shows us that conservation is not something that it is not known by Africans. Conservation always existed in Africa. So one thing I want us to take from this whole talk that I spoke about today and from the speakers before me, conservation is not a colonist concept. Conservation always existed in Africa. Siyathokoza, thank you. And I'd like to acknowledge these funders from UCT, SANBI, and NRF. Thank you, Rupert.
Wow, you dropped some bombs on us there. No, was it? I've always wanted to hear something like that on a BotSoc webinar, and here we are. So I think I'm going to allow for like maybe 5 to 10 minutes worth of discussion if all the participants can put your cameras on, and then just have a look in the Q&A. I think in the chat earlier, there was something about extractive. Luke Perkins had a question about extractive activities taking place under the umbrella of heritage, including things like vultures for muti and plants. When sustainable, it's fine, but is it sustainable? So I'm going to let you answer that, Nowazi, but I think firstly, there's a point someone was talking about blaming law enforcement, and I've got a favorite hobby horse in this space, is that from a law enforcement point of view, we tend to have only the smaller people that actually experience law enforcement. So, and especially visible ones like a traditional healer or a Rastafarian, versus the people who do the big damage in terms of, Deirdre was talking about monocultures being an issue, and we know that across the planet that's an issue of the conversion of natural land to either agriculture or to development. So I think when we talk about law enforcement, we also need to bring in that angle as well and ask, why is law enforcement against our natural heritage so inadequate, rather than just going for the easy targets of people who look different, that happen to have a couple of plants on them. So that's my first point. So Nolwazi, what do you want to pitch in there? Because I think your research has been very, very good up there, and your interactions up in Eshlangeni and Mpumalanga.
Yeah, so what I've seen, Rupert, is that most of the time we go to people with already a mindset of they are messing up, you know, they are the problem, and only to find that they also see the problem and they are already having their own solutions in the community. But because we assume that we need to go and educate them, that's when we start not understanding the value that they have of their own resource. So I'm just going to give an example of a community in Mpumalanga, whereby during COVID, there was this influx of people understanding what Artemisia Afra can do for the symptoms of COVID. So there was a pharmaceutical company that drove into that community in 2 trucks and wanted to wipe out Artemisia. The traditional council and the community stopped that from happening without any agency being called. So what we need to understand is that there are obviously individuals, and I'm not going to shy away from that are destructive to the environment. But we cannot now always approach people from a point of you are the one who's doing 1, 2, 3, without having sat down with them and tried to understand where they come from. Because you might find that the problem that you are observing as a conservationist or a scientist, they are observing it too. But now what is needed is just a place where we can sit down and talk, and they bring their problems along, we bring our problems along, we have a dialogue, and we find solutions together. Because most of the time, people in the rural areas are saying that people from outside are coming here and wiping out our medicinal plants, or any plants for that matter. So now the people are already custodians of that area. So what we now need to do, we need to incorporate these custodians in conservation, not only at implementation stage, but from the inception of the project. We should not be imposing.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly it. And what I've noticed in the last few years, with the final kind of transformation of researchers, by transformations I mean people from a variety of backgrounds, and not just your kind of classical Western educated people who aren't from the same backgrounds, is that all of a sudden we're getting to this point of actually starting to understand the problem a bit better. And it shouldn't be a surprise, but that's definitely what has happened. So I just wanted to, before we go to the questions again, I wanted to see if Deirdre, now that you've listened to the plant people, if you have any response from your heritage point of view.
Thank you so much. I think it's maybe just to echo what Nolwazi was saying in terms of problem solving or solutions, finding solutions. And particularly in the work that I've been doing around living heritage, looking at cultural policies, but also looking at policies across the kind of landscape of policies. So it's not only looking at culture specifically and heritage, but where countries are actually addressing issues of safeguarding living heritage, like traditional medicines and practices and all of that. It's really through consultation. It's not only about Western science. It's Western science meeting together with local communities who can identify what the problems are, very often in such great detail, because they are monitors of themselves and of behavior. in a way which is very hard for experts or specialists who come in and out can do. And so some of the best safeguarding practices that I have seen have been the ones that emerges from a conversation. And sometimes there's contestation because it's economic, it's about resources, access to resources, and so on. And so it's very hard. But even though it's difficult, it's rather the long road than the short road that then leads to plans imploding. Yeah. So consultation and participatory processes, I can't overemphasize how critical it is.
Yeah, so I've definitely been thinking about this for the last period in terms of how, and it's a new word, the projectification of our conservation work leads to this kind of short-termism where we have to drop in and out. You go to the community once or twice, you write a report, and maybe you'll send a copy of the report back, but it doesn't give you the time and space to build up these kind of trust relationships and so forth that we can actually take things forward. So every time a researcher comes, and Nolwazi, I don't think you'll mind me mentioning this from your work up north, is that when you and Thabo started working up in Tabachoyo, you almost had to fix some of the work that was done before, because there was almost that extractive in and out approach under the banner of conservation. So here you are, you're not related to the other people at all, but you first have to go and fix that before you can start with your own work.
I also wanted to say that this relationship building has such long ongoing, the example that I gave, for example, of working with the Kaya elders in the Mijikenda Kaya elders. I mean, it was because of this long standing relationship I could start raising gender issues. Me, an outsider, I could start asking questions around representation and whose heritage was being valued and protected and invested in, and so on. But it was because the relationship had been from the institution that I was working in at the time and myself was just engaging and having conversations and sitting on the ground and weaving together, and that then could lead to the more difficult conversations around gender issues and so on. Yeah.
No, it's the case of time. I'm going to bring in Glenn because it's interesting how we've discovered all these linkages now in terms of Deirdre, Glenn, and myself, and also Glenn's done a lot of his work up in Mpumalanga, Nolwazi used to be up in Kruger. So Glenn, given where you sit now in the Cape and in Ezeko, but also as a citizen scientist yourself, and an educator and a conservation trained person, do you want to pull this all together?
If I make the comparison between my urban setting far away from Mpumalanga and Limpopo to the Western Cape, to the city of Cape Town, the example, Nolwazi, that you brought about a community standing together and saying no to the extraction of a resource. What do we see there? We see that there's a sense of ownership and custodianship, which is communal. And often commercial enterprises are deeply individual. And there's a value chain, and there's a profit chain, and there are costs, and there's a balance sheet. But you only get that custodial sense, which then gets passed down as heritage and constitutes heritage, when communities have access to land over multiple generations. This can be destroyed quickly, but takes decades, generations to instill. In the urban context, that is missing, not because we don't have open spaces with natural resources in them, but because communities who use those resources do not feel a sense of ownership of the land, and therefore that sense of custodianship, and I'm not talking about valuing, but custodianship is absent. When we look at Table Mountain National Park, we hear about Rastafarian collectors. We hear about traditional. We hear about box stripping. Do we see the communities that are using those products, occupying space for cultural or spiritual purposes? I always look at the beauty of the religious practices on Sundays or on Saturdays in the mountains next to rivers. No matter how polluted the rivers are, we see on Sundays those pure white cloths of the African independent Zionist churches that need natural spaces to connect. No matter what the spiritual structure is. Are we welcoming, are we including, are we inviting such communities and saying, your occupying of space in a national park, in a nature reserve, in a city park is necessary, not is valued, not is welcome, not we invite you. It's like, why are you absent from the space? When you do that for long enough, there is that custodial sense, there is that sense of ownership, and it is communal. And because it is communal, the commercial enterprise becomes secondary. And so I really think that we need to reconceptualize the way we look at urban natural spaces, urban natural landscapes, or landscapes which have natural elements in them, particularly when we are looking at indigenous culture here. Particularly in an area of great flux and change in the Western Cape, in the city of Cape Town. We can't be puritanical and purist about this. We can't impose taxonomies on people because there's no template for spirituality. But what we can say is that there are indigenous populations in the places that they come from. There is a deep connection to the land and the resources that come from the land. There is a natural connection when people feel custodianship to a landscape. No matter how much of it is left, if we look at something the size of Kenilworth Racecourse, if we look at something the size of Rondebosch Common, these are areas which need indigenous practices, which need the presence and the occupation of space of indigenous groups or groups that are organized around indigenous practice. When this is normalized, I think it will be, people become not only accountable, but protective about what is theirs.
Cool. Yeah, so I made notes again, but there's two things specifically. When you were talking about the value chain, Glenn, in the modern value chain, there's a lot of talk about sustainability, but it's almost a rootless sustainability compared to what we're talking about here, in terms of deep ties, deep connections, and a relationship with land. It's sustainability becomes a tick box exercise for corporates, essentially. And then I did want to say that definitely compared to when I was at Cape Nature, compared to when I started and compared to when I left the organization, there was much more of a willingness to start engaging with allocating space for spiritual uses on nature reserves, which definitely was not the case in 2008. So there is progress. It's incremental and obviously a lot of time slower than we want it to be, but there is progress nonetheless. So I know we could have this conversation for the next 3 hours. What I'm going to suggest, I've got 2 more slides that I need to share. Then we will end the formal webinar, as in I will stop streaming on YouTube, but we can still stay online if Nolwazi, Glenn, and Dedra have got some time. And I'll continue recording just so that we've got a record of the conversation and people can still ask more questions. Are we okay with that? Cool. So thank you guys. Just switch your cameras off and I'm going to share screen again. And try and find my PowerPoint. which I have closed. So just give me a second. So stop sharing. Excuse me, I'm talking you all through this. Right. So just a quick ad break again, because at BotSoc we sometimes tend to gloss over some of the good things that we've done, and this book is one that has suffered from under representation or under marketing, because it was launched just at the beginning of 2020 and we all know what happened then. But it's a fantastic book, Cultures, Cures and Curiosities, speaking about the plant law and legend of the Eastern Cape. And it's got great stories and also original artwork like this Hidnora, which is a medicinal plant and a parasite, fascinating, and was actually flowering in the Karoo Botanical Gardens now when we were there, and is on sale currently at the BotSoc bookshop. I've dropped the link into the chat. And then I want to finish off this evening by formally thanking our guests, Deirdre, Nolwazi, and Glenn, for bringing such richness to the conversation. And I think we, like I said, we're going to continue it now after we press stop. But also just to remind ourselves that the next webinar is the Great Southern BioBlitz PEP rally, which happens on the 27th of October. So last Friday of each month. You can see it's the day before the GSB starts. Crew will be doing all sorts of training, as well as our colleagues. The Great Southern BioBlitz is really a cosmopolitan across the Southern Hemisphere thing, where there are people from all over Sub-Saharan Africa, our friends in Australia who are very involved, South America as well. And there's lots of training and action going on. So just keep an eye on the Great Southern BioBlitz Instagram, as well as the BotSoc social media channels. I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. So I'm just going to end the streaming on YouTube, but for those of you who want to continue